Good morning. This is Jason D coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is Friday at about 10:35. So yeah, I again, what I do with this channel, or what I try to do with this channel, is try to mix things up a lot. It's mostly things have shifted for me greatly for this channel. I tend, which is the thing I always have done. It's something that's always been a part, or a big part of how I kind of just put out, why I put out the videos I do, and all those things. I tend to always talk about movies that, well, all the movies that about 98% of the movies that I do on the show are all movies from my own collection. So I'm a big collector of film. It's pretty much it's kind of my number one passion. I buy music. I'm one of those people that buys physical media, CDs. I listen to CDs a lot. I used to buy records a lot and vinyl. Eventually, I probably will again, but mainly it's films. I buy more films than anything else. So most of these shows are always on movies that I actually own in my personal collection. And the other thing I tend to do, or two other things I always do is I don't really put out negative reviews on films. I pretty much showcase movies that I see, um, the movies that I've bought over the last few years, or over the years, that I just really, really love and that I really have a deep appreciation for. They're inspiring. So I mainly talk about movies in a positive light, movies that I personally really connect with. And then I make an exception sometimes or I do make an exception of, like, when I go to a movie, when I go to the actual movies, I usually put up a review of that movie or that experience, whether it was a good one or a bad one. And then, so that's a little bit of a different take for how I do it. And the majority of movies that I cover, the channel it's always been a huge part of it, and it is my favorite style, my main jam. It's something I always go back to, and it's something I'm always in that world. But most everything I do is all like the old school horror exploitation world. I do stay up on new movies, current movies. I try to, I try to see new things when I can. I've been kind of disgruntled. I've seen some films that I've really liked. I might do like which I don't usually do, but I don't think I've done it in the past. But I might do a year end kind of review of some films that I've seen that I have liked. Probably the best movie I've seen this year, as far as horror films, is definitely The Substance. That movie is just like uh, completely insane. Um, and I recently just saw two other movies, one being a horror movie and one not being a horror movie. But one that I did see is Nicolas Cage's Longlegs, which just came out on DVD or Blu-ray about a week or two ago, and that was kind of an interesting movie. I kind of liked it. I don't know, like I'm kind of wanting to see it again. I woke up with this craving of wanting to see it, and it's a pretty interesting movie. So I'm gonna do a show, um, and it was a movie that I heard from a few people that saw it that really trashed it pretty badly. So I'm gonna do a show on Long Legs, starring Nicolas Cage, probably pretty soon. But today's show is gonna be on another movie that I just saw, totally, outside of, or outside of what I'm talking about right here as far as genre wise. But there's the new, um, I just watched the new Kevin Costner movie, Horizon, which is a huge, um, multi-million dollar western that Kevin Costner wrote and directed. And it came out in July of this year. And it's 2 hours and 44 minutes. And boy, does it feels longer, actually, in all actuality. Kevin Costner pretty much fully financed this film by himself, or these films. This film into itself cost about $100 million for him to make, and he self financed it. He self made this movie. He directed it. He wrote the film. He's one of the lead actors and spent his own money on this film. And from what I read, that this film had been something that he had been wanting to do for many years, 20 years or something like that. And the other thing about this movie is that this is like supposed to be there's supposed to be three films coming out. It's supposed to be a trilogy, uh, Horizon. There, the first one came out in July this year, 2024, and then the second one was supposed to come out in August, which was so. I remember hearing about this movie, and I was really like, wow. I do like Kevin Costner. Um, I think he's made some really great films as a director. I think Open Range is probably his best movie he's done. That's a really good Western. I'm a huge Western fan. I've covered some Westerns on this show and on this channel. And um, so I'm actually a huge old school American, John Ford fan. I love all of the classic spaghetti western movies. I'm a huge western fan, and I have dived into it to a degree. My love of westerns, and I will do, I'm sure, future shows on westerns. But I think Open Range is a really great film. It's a pretty epic movie. I think it's the best movie he's ever directed. And I do like, even though it kind of gets panned a lot and gets kind of shit on a lot, I'm actually a really big fan of Dances with Wolves. Really great film. I got that on Blu-ray a few years back, and I actually really love that movie. I think it's a real, just a real cinematic kind of experience. And he's acted and starred in some really good films, and so I was curious about this movie. And when this movie came out, it it bombed terribly, terribly. It made such an incredibly dismal amount of money that the studio that was going to release the second part basically pulled the plug on it and decided not to release it in August, which is crazy. And I don't think there has been a date mentioned or talked about as to when they're going to release the second one. And I heard some hype around this movie. I heard that this one, Horizon premiered at the Cannes Film Festival. It got a standing ovation. And this movie clocks in. It's close to 3 hours. It's two hours and 44 minutes. And I watched this last night. I went over to my folks last night for Chinese food and movies, and we watched Long Legs, the new Nicolas Cage movie, and then we watched Horizon. So it was a good, probably 7 or 8 hours of movies. Um, so when I heard that this movie got a standing ovation at Cannes Film Festival, and supposedly people were clapping for like 20 minutes or whatever after. And again, this movie is 2 hours and 44 minutes, and it feels like, uh, oh my god, this movie feels like fucking eternity. Like, it feels like you're in, it, because of the length of it, it feels like you're trapped in movie hell. That's the only way I can describe it. And when I think about that quote, and maybe it's just all bullshit. I'm just like, what? How in the fuck is that possible? How would that move? How would it? I like literally after this movie was done, I'm like running for the fucking bathroom. Um, and this movie has moments of where it kind of is interesting. There was a couple of key points in this movie where I felt pretty invested in it. I'm like, okay, it's getting its rhythm. I'm into this. And then it just like started going back to this thing of where it's just kind of meandering, and you're not, nothing is really you're not really being told anything, and nothing really seems to matter, and there's no tension, there's no like gravitas, there's no nothing that's pulling you into the story, and it has these fleeting moments of where, oh, okay, this is like, this can be good, you know, and then it just totally fucking dissipates. But overall, this movie is, it's such a weird movie because it's so long. And the thing is, and certain criticisms I had heard about this movie is that this people were saying it doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like basically a television show, and it totally. That was the thing I felt in the first 40 minutes of this movie is like, this is totally a television show. This does not feel like a movie, and it's really weird. It does not feel like you're watching a movie. Yeah, it's, you know, it's, there are some beautiful, there is some beautiful cinematography. You know, there are some really great shots, but it just feels like, especially around the editing, it feels like you're watching a series. It's really weird, so it's hard. It's hard to get into it for me, at least. It was hard to kind of get into it, just on that, you know, just from that kind of perspective, because it was like it's billed as this epic, you know, kind of sweeping old school classic western, but a movie experience. And it does have elements where I do say there are elements of it where it does feel like, again, I'm a huge fan of the classic American western westerns of John Ford, you know, who, you know, just one of the greatest directors ever, and one of the greatest western directors. So there are things about this movie that it does have that old school kind of John Ford vibe, but it really gets lost in the woods. It gets lost in the woods of where you're not really. I mean, you can understand what's going on, but it doesn't seem to really mean anything, and it just doesn't really go anywhere, and it just kind of goes on. There are scenes in this movie. But, well, one example, there's a scene of where Kevin Costner does not appear into the movie until about an hour or so into the movie, maybe more. And he plays this character or there's a scene where he is like having this conversation with this woman who is a prostitute who is trying to like basically solicit him. And it's interesting for like the first 2 or 3 minutes. It's an interesting dialogue. It's kind of, kind of engaging, but then it just goes on and on for like, it feels like fucking forever, and you're like, why wasn't this edited down, or why wasn't the writing dialed up a little bit more, or dialed in a little bit more to make it more interesting to where you're actually kind of getting information. It just kind of meanders, and they're walking during this conversation, and it literally just, it's boring. It gets to a point where it's just boring and you don't care, but it just goes on for fucking ever. And there's a series of all of these kinds of conversational pieces in the movie where it's kind of interesting for a few minutes, but then each conversation just goes on and on and on and on, to where it's like, you just like, my first reaction was like, wow, somebody should have edited the shit out of this movie. Um, there's so many scenes in this movie that just go on and on and on. And from what I read, Kevin Costner looked at this whole big project as like a total passion project. And and but a lot of times when I hear directors say that, I think another good example of that, where it was supposedly this like project that particular director wanted to make. It was like the movie he wanted to make his whole life. And I think a really good example of that is Peter Jackson's King Kong, coming off of the heels of course, the first three Lord of the Rings movies, which were, brilliant kind of masterpieces. And then he makes King Kong, and it's so dry and barren and kind of boring and just overstuffed, and just, too self-indulgent, to where self-indulgent, I think, for me, for this describing this film is the biggest component because it feels like Kevin Costner spent all of this money on this movie, and there wasn't one time, I don't think, one person that he was working with felt like, okay, okay, buddy, you gotta fucking reel it in here. Like, this is, you've crossed the line, you've gone too far. There is no way someone's gonna be able to sit through this movie for this long, and it's time to rail it in. It's time to pull it in. Um, like somebody there to act as like a check man or a referee, and it feels like none of that obviously happened in this movie. And I'm surprised, like this film could have been this thing if it was it is an example of being too self-indulgent. But I would have had a little bit more respect for this movie if it was that, you know, kind of thing, but in a different direction, where it was, maybe a little bit more in the house realm, or like it had an emphasis more on the aesthetic of the film, or the violence of the film, or kind of the grittiness of life during the Wild West, or I don't know. But it just feels very. I don't know. It feels like it doesn't have any grit to it. It feels very vanilla too. It feels very straightforward, boring as hell. Although I said there are moments where you feel like I felt like I was kind of getting into it, and then it would just like veer off, fall off the tracks, drive itself off the tracks. But it feels like it's very vanilla because I feel like Open Range, I think, is a perfect example, and then also I think even Dances with Wolves, but more so Open Range. It's got a little bit of grit to it and gravitas, and there's like a little bit more dirt to it. It's just it's got a little edge to it, and it's not so vanilla. Like this movie just feels like a movie you would throw on and watch with your kids, but like not pay attention to half of it, and then your kids would hate it and they'd be bored as shit too, and then you want to take it out. Whereas Open Range, it's got a little bit more of an adult kind of thing to it. It's the last half of that movie is like spectacular gunfights and it's brutal as hell, but it's just got it's got some grit to it. And this movie just feels really vanilla and just man, and it just goes on and on for fucking ever. And I watched it with my folks last night. And because they love a good western, especially my dad, and I do too. I haven't seen a new western in quite a while, and my folks like Kevin Costner. I rented it knowing that I had heard pretty much bad things about this movie, but I was like, well, fuck it, I'll watch it. And I have to say, I think it was a little bit worse than what I had heard. It's once you get past the 2 hour mark, it's kind of a grating, painful experience because I was literally, I knew going into watching Horizon, I knew it was going to be a very long movie. Um, but when it got to the 2 hour mark, I'm like, I was I was kind of dying inside. I was like, this has to fucking end. I can't take it anymore. Um, I have to get more out of this movie as a fan of film, or just just a person who paid money to see this. I have to get more out of this. This movie is just like kind of has been going has been on this aimless journey for hours, really. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? And it got to be painful, and I I almost couldn't take it. I haven't had that experience in a long time. And the funny thing is I was really curious about this movie when I first heard about it. I've heard it being compared, or it was compared at times to Yellowstone, which is a Kevin Costner show, which is like a western. I've never seen it. I've heard pretty good things about it. But I heard it's kind of compared to that. Um, and I knew it was going to be long. But the main thing for me right away, again, within 35 minutes of this movie, was I was like, this is not a movie. You can't even call this a movie experience. It's totally a fucking TV show. It's kind of like a standard, just run of the mill melodrama, you know, streaming TV show. That's what it feels like. It's just, it's so straightforward. Um and I know, like, it's ambitious to a degree because you're trying to be introduced to all of these different characters and how it's related to this, like, town that all of these people from different walks of life, they're trying to, they all eventually move or try to move to this town that's called Horizon. And so it's kind of got this whole, like, kind of big scale of, like, people's journeys and how they're getting there. But it's like, I don't know, like, it was interesting for about 5 minutes, and then you're just like, I don't give a fuck. Like, come on, wrap it up. And there's gonna be 3 hours or three movies. I'm just like, oh my god. It was kind of painful. And the thing that's so weird about this movie is at the end of this movie, there are, like, these coming attractions for the second movie, and it's so weird. It doesn't make any sense. Why would they do that? And it shows a lot. It shows a lot of the characters that you're given. It shows you where they go, and there's, like, this vignette of all of these scenes and things that happen in the plot and scenarios to, like, I guess, whet your appetite to see the second movie. And I'm just like, what? My folks did not like this movie. My mom especially thought it was, like, just kind of a generic TV show, and it was kind of, well, wicked boring, and it just goes on and on. There's no real there's no action in this film. There's a couple action or gunfights in the film, and so if you're into that kind of thing and the Western world, you're not going to get that here. And I like slow movies. I like movies that have a slow burn to them. And I'm going to do a review on Long Legs probably tomorrow. That movie's very slow, but it's pretty engaging in a lot of ways. But anyway, this movie was a painful, 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 painful fucking experience. Um, don't waste your time or effort or money. I have zero interest in seeing any of these other movies that he supposedly has directed in this weird franchise. It's so fucking boring. It's such a vanilla, like, marathon of mindless, self-indulgent, just BS. It's, yeah, I would cancel, hit unsubscribe. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.